in which growing maturity rekindles the relationship between one pair of lovers, and self-absorption carries another pair to the brink of death. Chapter 19. The mistake Alexei Alexandrovitch had made while preparing to see his wife, in not taking into account the eventuality that her repentance would be sincere and he would forgive her, and then she would not die. This mistake presented itself to him in all its force 2 months after his return from Moscow. But the mistake came not only from his not having taken this eventuality into account, but also from the fact that, prior to the day when he saw his dying wife, he had not known his own heart. At his wife's bedside he had given himself, for the first time in his life, to that feeling of tender compassion which other people's suffering evoked in him, and which he had previously been ashamed of as a bad weakness. Pity for her, and repentance at having wished for her death, and above all the very joy of forgiveness, made it so that he suddenly felt not only relief from his suffering, but also an inner peace that he had never experienced before. He suddenly felt that the very thing that had once been the source of his suffering had become the source of his spiritual joy, that what had seemed insoluble when he condemned, reproached, and hated, became simple and clear when he forgave and loved. He forgave his wife, and pitied her for her sufferings and repentance. He forgave Vronsky and pitied him, especially after rumors reached him of his desperate act. He also pitied his son more than before, and now reproached himself for having been too little concerned with him. But for the newborn little girl, he had some special feeling, not only of pity but also of tenderness. At first it was only out of compassion that he concerned himself with the newborn, weak little girl, who was not his daughter, and who was neglected during her mother's illness, and would probably have died if he had not looked after her. And he did not notice how he came to love her. He went to the nursery several times a day and sat there for a long while, so that the wet nurse and the nanny, who were intimidated at first, became used to him. He would sometimes spend half an hour silently gazing at the saffron-red, downy, and wrinkled little face of the sleeping baby, watching the movements of her scowling forehead and plump little hands with curled fingers that rubbed her little eyes and nose with their backs. At such moments especially, Alexei Alexandrovitch felt utterly at peace and in harmony with himself, and saw nothing extraordinary in his situation, nothing that needed to be changed. But the more time that passed, the more clearly he saw that, natural as the situation was for him now, he would not be allowed to remain in it. He felt that, besides the good spiritual force that guided his soul, there was another force, crude and equally powerful, if not more so, that guided his life, and that this force would not give him the humble peace he desired. He felt that everybody looked at him with questioning surprise, not understanding him, and expecting something from him. In particular, he felt the precariousness and unnaturalness of his relations with his wife. When the softening produced in her by the nearness of death passed, Alexey Alexandrovitch began to notice that Anna was afraid of him, felt burdened by him, and could not look him straight in the eye. It was as if there was something she wanted but could not bring herself to say to him, and as if, also anticipating that their relations could not continue, she expected something from him. At the end of February, it happened that Anna's newborn daughter, who had also been named Anna, fell ill. Alexey Alexandrovitch visited the nursery in the morning, and after giving orders to send for the doctor, went to the ministry. Having finished his work, he returned home towards 4 o'clock. On entering the front hall, he saw a handsome footman in galloons and a bearskin cape, holding a white cloak of American dog. "Who is here?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Princess Elizaveta Fyodorovna Tverskoy," the footman replied, with what seemed to Alexey Alexandrovitch like a smile. Throughout that difficult time, Alexey Alexandrovitch had noticed that his society acquaintances, especially the women, took a special interest in him and his wife. He had noticed that all these acquaintances had trouble concealing their joy over something, the same joy he had seen in the lawyer's eyes, and now in the eyes of the footman. They were all as if delighted, as if they were getting somebody married. When meeting him, they would ask about his wife's health with barely concealed joy. The presence of Princess Tverskoy, both by the memories associated with her and because he generally disliked her, was unpleasant for Alexey Alexandrovitch, and he went directly to the nursery. In the first nursery, Seryosha, his chest leaning on the desk and his legs on the chair, was drawing something and merrily talking away. The English governess, who had replaced the French woman during Anna's illness, was sitting by the boy crocheting mignardise, and hastily rose and curtsied, giving Seryosha a tug. Alexey Alexandrovitch stroked the boy's hair with his hand, answered the governess' question about his wife's health, and asked what the doctor had said about the baby. The doctor said there was nothing dangerous, and prescribed baths. "But she's still suffering," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, listening to the baby crying in the next room. "I think the wet nurse is no good, sir," the governess said resolutely. "What makes you think so?" he asked, stopping. "That's what happened with Countess Paul, sir. The baby was treated, but it turned out that it was simply hungry. The wet nurse had no milk, sir." Alexey Alexandrovitch reflected, and, after standing there for a few seconds, went through the other door. The little girl lay, her head thrown back, squirming in the wet nurse's arms, and refused either to take the plump breast offered to her or to be silent, despite the double shushing of the wet nurse and the nanny leaning over her. "Still no better?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "She's very restless," the nanny answered in a whisper. "Miss Edwards said the wet nurse may have no milk," he said. "I've been thinking so myself, Alexey Alexandrovitch." "Then why didn't you say so?" "Who was I to say it to? Anna Arkadyevna's still unwell," the nanny said, displeased. The nanny was an old household servant, and in these simple words of hers, Alexey Alexandrovitch seemed to hear a hint at his situation. The baby cried still louder, ran out of breath, and choked. The nanny waved her hand, went over to her, took her from the wet nurse's arms, and began rocking her as she walked. "We must ask the doctor to examine the wet nurse," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. The healthy-looking, well-dressed wet nurse, afraid that she might be dismissed, muttered something under her breath, and, hiding away her big breast, smiled contemptuously at any doubt of her milkiness. In that smile, Alexey Alexandrovitch also detected mockery of his situation. "Poor baby," said the nanny, hushing the baby and continuing to walk. Alexey Alexandrovitch sat down on a chair and, with a suffering, downcast face, watched the nanny pacing back and forth. When the baby finally quieted and was lowered into the deep crib, and the nanny straightened the pillow and backed away, Alexei Alexandrovitch got up and, walking with difficulty on tiptoe, went over to look. For a minute he stood silently with the same downcast face, but suddenly a smile, moving the hair and skin of his forehead, showed on his face, and he left the room just as quietly. In the dining room he rang and told the servant who came to send for the doctor again. He was vexed with his wife for not taking care of this lovely baby, and he did not want to go to her in this irritated mood, nor did he want to see Princess Betsy. But his wife might wonder why he did not come to her as usual, and therefore he made an effort and went to her bedroom. Going over the soft carpet to her door, he inadvertently heard a conversation he did not want to hear. "If you weren't going away, I would understand your refusal, and his as well, but your husband ought to be above that," Betsy was saying. "I don't want it, not for my husband's sake, but for my own. Don't say it, Anna, or don't say it." Anna's agitated voice replied, "Yes, but you can't not want to say goodbye to a man who shot himself on account of you. That's why I don't want to." Alexei Alexandrovitch stopped with a frightened and guilty expression, and was about to go back unnoticed. But, considering that it would be unworthy of him, he turned again and, coughing, went towards the bedroom. The voices fell silent, and he went in. Anna, in a gray dressing gown, her short cropped black hair growing again like a thick brush on her round head, was sitting on the couch. As always, at the sight of her husband, the animation on her face suddenly vanished. She bowed her head and glanced round uneasily at Betsy. Betsy, dressed after the very latest fashion in a hat that hovered somewhere over her head like a lampshade over a lamp, and in a dove-gray dress with sharp diagonal stripes going one way on the bodice and the other way on the skirt, was sitting by Anna, holding her flat, tall figure erect and bowing her head. She met Alexei Alexandrovitch with a mocking smile. "Ah," she said, as if surprised, "I'm very glad you're home. You don't show yourself anywhere, and I haven't seen you since Anna became ill. I've heard all about your attentiveness. Yes, you are an amazing husband," she said with a meaningful and benign look, as though conferring an order of magnanimity on him for his behavior towards his wife. Alexei Alexandrovitch bowed coldly, and, after kissing his wife's hand, asked about her health. "I think I'm better," she said, avoiding his eyes. "But your face seems to have a feverish color," he said, emphasizing the word feverish. "We've talked too much," said Betsy. "I feel it's been egoism on my part, and I'm leaving." She stood up, but Anna, suddenly blushing, quickly seized her hand. "No, stay a moment, please. I must tell you. No, you." She turned to Alexei Alexandrovitch, and the crimson spread over her neck and forehead. "I cannot and do not wish to keep anything concealed from you," she said. Alexei Alexandrovitch cracked his fingers and bowed his head. "Betsy was saying that Count Vronsky wished to come here and say goodbye before he leaves for Tashkent." She was not looking at her husband, and was obviously hurrying to say everything, difficult as it was for her. "I said I could not receive him." "You said, my friend, that it would depend on Alexei Alexandrovitch," Betsy corrected her. "But no, I cannot receive him, and there's no point in—" She suddenly stopped and glanced questioningly at her husband. He was not looking at her. "In short, I don't want to." Alexei Alexandrovitch stirred and was about to take her hand. Her first impulse was to pull her hand away from his moist hand with its big, swollen veins as it sought hers, but with an obvious effort she took it. I am very grateful for your confidence, but, he said, feeling with embarrassment and vexation that what he could resolve easily and clearly in himself, he could not discuss in front of Princess Verskoy, who was for him an embodiment of that crude force which was to guide his life in the eyes of the world, and which prevented him from giving himself to his feeling of love and forgiveness. He stopped, looking at Princess Verskoy. Well, goodbye, my lovely, said Betsy, getting up. She kissed Anna and went out. Alexey Alexandrovitch saw her off. Alexey Alexandrovitch, I know you to be a truly magnanimous man, said Betsy, stopping in the small drawing-room and pressing his hand once more especially firmly. I am an outsider, but I love her and respect you so much that I will allow myself this advice. Receive him. Alexey Vronsky is the embodiment of honor, and he is leaving for Tashkent. Thank you, Princess, for your concern and advice, but my wife will decide for herself the question of whether she can or cannot receive someone. He said this out of habit, with a dignified raising of eyebrows, and at once reflected that, whatever his words might be, there could be no dignity in his position, and this he saw in the restrained, spiteful, and mocking smile with which Betsy looked at him after his phrase. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.